Hello and welcome back to the Questioning Behaviour Podcast. My name is Sarah, and as always, I am joined by the magnificent Merle of course, who needs no further introduction.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying.
But someone who does maybe need a bit of an introduction is our guest to this episode. We are very pleased to welcome Steve Shu to the podcast. And without further ado, Steve, would you be able to introduce yourself to the audience? Who are you? What do you do? And how did you get there?
Sure. So yes, my name's Steve Shu. Normally I'm based in Ithaca, New York these days. I most recently moved from Los Angeles. And my day job, I work for a behavioral science consultancy. And I'm also a part-time visiting lecturer incoming at Cornell University. I finished my PhD actually just earlier this year. My career has spanned about 3 decades. So I started off as an engineer, an electrical engineer. And I spent probably the first decade of my career doing kind of engineering things in electrical engineering. So things related to audio processing and very deep stuff there. And then at some point I switched gears and said I wanted to do more business. And so I went to get an MBA at Chicago Booth.
As you do.
And started in finance and then switched into management consulting. And so that started sort of the next phase of my career where I've been more or less 20 years in consulting. I had kids, and when I had kids, I decided I didn't want to travel so much. And so I decided to, take my technology skills and raise money for a startup. And so I raised money for a startup. And then somewhere along the line, I specialized in starting new things with companies. It took me probably, I would say 15 years to really identify that as something that I was really good at. I was like taking something new, bridging ideas from new areas and bringing people together from different backgrounds, scientists with business people. And so along the lines, I ran into Shlomo Benartzi, who's a famous behavioral economist. And this was probably in the 2009 timeframe where people were thinking, well, we saw these initiatives around behavioral science and nudge units in government and thought about how could we start these initiatives at companies? And so I ran into him and, my skills were, I did not really know much about behavioral science other than taking classes during my MBA in behavioral science. And so we sort of merged our skills together. And then I spent the past 13 some years working on setting up nudge units kind of within companies. So that's a quick, I don't know if that was a long background or a quick background. It was a quick background since it was 30 years, but.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, given the time you've spanned with that explanation, I'd say it's pretty quick, I'd argue. There's a lot to unpack there.
Sure.
There's loads of questions I want to ask, but a very quick one just in between. You took behavioral science classes in your MBA program.
Well, yes. So they were organizational behavior. I took my first classes with George Wu here.
Lovely.
Who we're still friends with. And then I think, what other courses did I take? I mean, they call it organizational. I don't know what they call it here now, actually, but it's organizational behavior. So I took negotiations, those
good.
types of classes. Yes.
All right.
Cool.
Yep.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So, the question that is on everybody's minds as we are doing a specific series, when and why did you do a PhD?
Oh, yeah. So, my background, my background has generally been a jack of all trades.
Sure.
So I spent probably, although I guess the first 10 years was like specialized engineering. Then I spent the next 10 kind of as a jack of all trades, raising money, doing business development, starting new initiatives, working in healthcare.
All right.
And so when we started this new behavioral science initiative, and I met up with Shlomo Benartzi, we started starting these nudge units, and part of it was developing thought leadership, and part of it also included publications. So during that time frame, Shlomo was writing a new book, Save More Tomorrow, And so I did a lot of the background research on that and started becoming very familiar with the literature. It was like a few at least a year and a half process writing the book, and so there was a lot of time to get familiar with the core literature. And so in the background, I was always gaining more and more knowledge about behavioral science. And at some point along the line, I ran into a client who was our key contact had started a PhD, and it was more like, if I was going to maintain this client, I'd have to up my game, and it might be a good bonding experience. And so I decided to kind of embark down that path to pursue that. So I mean, I had already, and since I'd been working in behavioral science during my day job, I thought probably naively that I could get some overlap between my job and the PhD, but it ended up being a lot less overlap than I expected. So it was a mixture of overlap with my work, that I'd done some prior work on sort of background literature review and developed some appreciation for science. And then it was just sort of a matter of the moment where I had a client that was doing it, and that just seemed like the right opportunity.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, first of all, congratulations on completing the PhD. That's no small feat or small undertaking, and so soon out of it. I mean, at this point now, looking backwards, like, what did you get out of doing the PhD, and was it what you expected?
What did I get out of the PhD?
The doctor's title doesn't count. That's expected.
I mean, I didn't realize I'd enjoy the research process as much as I did. I like that it's fairly structured. You try and be very logical and pin things down. And after you actually complete it, it's kind of interesting that you've studied this one thing that you can sort of claim in the world that, maybe you've studied more than other folks. So that was a thing. Things that I've learned during the process, I did want to pick up some things that I hadn't really done through kind of the literature review. So, I wanted to learn a little bit more about the research methods in the behavioral area. I picked up really focused things, like I wanted to implement, let's say, query theory from Eric Johnson and others there to help understand, psychological thinking. And I also wanted to sort of up my quantitative skills in analyzing data. So those were some of the things I think that I wanted to get. But I knew that it was for me, it was a lot. I mean, I had been immersed in the space for more than a decade now, so I kind of knew a bit about sort of where I wanted to go, where I didn't want to go, and you always stayed focused on a good PhD is like a completed PhD. I think was the mantra that followed.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm just curious. I mean, I can see the motivation for doing the PhD, although I have to say, relatively unique one. I don't think I've heard it before. But going into a PhD with the experience, the work experience that you already had, do you think that made much of a difference?
I think in terms of work experience, does that make a difference? So most of my research is field research as opposed to, and so I think it helps in the sense, a key aspect actually during the interview process was making sure that you could get access to data.
Of course.
And so having that work experience is helpful, because for the field work, there's always this gap between what the company wants to get out of it and what the academic researcher wants to get out of it. And so having that work experience allowed me to navigate that a bit better. I mean, some companies basically view, academic, it's more like a consulting relationship. And we've had some cases where, for example, ran data and the company decided just to give us summary data, for example, at the end of it, and didn't realize that we needed individual data points to actually analyze anything. We couldn't just take like two numbers that they give us. So I think having the kind of the work experience helped kind of navigate that, sort of find the sweet spot between the company and sort of the researcher. So that was probably the biggest thing I would say. I think also in terms of pitching the ideas, I think it helped in that regard, because I could realize when I'm talking with the companies, they're not really buying the idea. So I'd go back and maybe I'd do a few lab studies, develop some additional evidence. We could say that, this is what we've done. You're not the total guinea pig, if you will, for this. So I think it helped in that regard. It doesn't help get any respect during the PhD process from the academics at all. I knew that it was going to happen, but it was kind of surprising to face that in reality. It's like, oh yeah, everyone talks about it. It doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't really matter, I guess.
Okay.
It helps in being able to be directed, I guess, in the sense that you really want to make progress, and you can, if you're spinning your wheels, you can kind of quickly say that and cut things off. So I think that helps. But,
okay, sure. I should have specified the question maybe a bit better, although I'm very happy with this answer as well. Don't take it the wrong way. I meant it more as in, so for example, Sarah and I, we came into the PhD straight out of education. So not only did we have a lot less work experience, we were also a lot younger. And as a result, the gap between us and our supervisors, as seen with most PhDs, is quite large. Do you feel that to that extent that you were maybe better prepared for dealing with a more senior academic, that your relationship with your supervisor might have been better or more progress oriented as a result of it? Because obviously within academia, especially if you enter this level of academia relatively young with no real work experience, not knowing really who you are as a person because you're lacking that type of experience and you don't have the work experience either, there does seem to be the thing that people struggle more with also the inclusion of mental health issues. So from that aspect, do you think having had your work experience or having been a more mature PhD student, was that beneficial, do you think?
So in that regard, I do think it is. Having worked for a long time, is like, if this PhD thing doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world. I've survived this long and everything, so I know that there's like a ton of pressure. So I maybe I take that too lightly. So that's one aspect. And I think as part of that, you're able to carry kind of a different relationship with the advisor in some sense that, you can, I won't say you're not peer, but given that you're bringing that much kind of work experience to the table, and if you're doing field research, you realize you're the player. You understand the field environment, and you're looking to your advisors for kind of the academic and scientific guidance, and also the political guidance. How do you get through this process?
Sure.
So that helps a lot for sure. I'm trying to think of what else. No, I think that's mostly it. I think it definitely does help.
Yeah, as you sort of alluded to, there is a bit of a time penalty and a bit of a risk to go and do a PhD after if you have sort of an established career, established salary. You are sort of taking time out of that sort of safety net in order to get this training. It is a bit of a risk that you may feel you're able to take a bit more if you're younger. So, but how was it for you? You sort of, you sound as though you're not afraid to try new things, like judging based on your extensive career and career changes and switches. But did it feel like it was a risk at all, or not at all?
Feel like a risk? I think since I probably unusual circumstances. A lot of the folks that I work with on a day-to-day basis are academics. I tried to get the real story on whether they thought I could make it through this process. Most didn't doubt that I could make it through the process.
That's nice.
So that was good enough, right, for me. And I knew that there was enough overlap with the work that I was doing. So it wasn't that big of a risk. When I say I do a bunch of things, usually I try to experiment a little bit. So I try and dip my toe in 30%, and then I'll get sucked in completely. So that's sort of what I did here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You feel like you've been sucked in completely now?
Well, now, so, I've spent most of my time doing consulting. Now, my experiment right now is the kind of 20-30% research and teaching. So there is an experiment going on right now. I'm not sure whether I will push consulting down, whether I will, who knows exactly. Maybe I won't like teaching as much as I, dreamed about it. And maybe I'll grab. I didn't expect to like research as much as I did. To be honest, I thought it was going to be all the about teaching, because I like interacting with people. I found research may be too focused like on things, if you will.
Sure.
But I don't know. Maybe during that process I realized that whole analyzing things and focusing on things is a piece of it, but it's not like 80% of it. It can be 20% of it or 15% of it, right? A lot of it can be discussing research designs with folks, gathering knowledge from other colleagues in the space. So
yeah, this is a lucky thing with research, obviously depending on which field you're in, but you can very often make it as solitary or as collaborative as you like it to be, which helps.
I think so.
So that's good. So Steve, to get a bit more specific, so you've already mentioned you're currently, your main day job is consulting. You've mentioned that you've done this before as well. Your work had a lot of overlap with your PhD. So talk me a bit through what your PhD was and how the topic developed, because I'm trying to figure out what exactly the overlap was.
Oh, sure. So a lot of the consulting, first of all, has been related to helping financial services companies.
Okay.
And financial services companies vary from wealth management, where advisors work with individuals. Some of our retirement sort of record keepers, which basically keep assets, retirement assets. To make a long story short, a lot of the projects that we've been doing are really helping those companies to develop better user experiences, better processes to help people to, become, better financial wellness, save more for retirement, those types of things. And so my research area was basically in the area of savings, both for retirement and also for emergency savings, and mixture of research that looked at actual outcomes. So for example, one research paper that I'm hoping to release fairly soon is in the retirement space, we've been doing this thing of saving a certain percent of your salary. But we know that numeracy and financial literacy is very challenging in very areas. So some of the things they've done in the medical space are to reframe things, like instead of 10% of patients, it's 10 out of every 100 patients, worked by Ellen Peters and others. So we tried a similar thing in this area, which is reframing savings as pennies for every dollar you earn versus percent of salary, and kind of doing a randomized controlled trial there and looking how it affects and basically there's evidence that we reduce gaps in saving between those who are either lower income and higher income, or those with less numeracy, if you will, that it's a bit of an easier lift psychologically. So my research is a lot in those areas, using information reframing. So that's the overlap.
Awesome. Okay.
But where it doesn't overlap is, the 10 dozen paper rewrites that the company doesn't appreciate. But, in order to get through the process of co-authors, journals, and everything else, that's where there's like no overlap.
I see.
Yeah. I'm interested in these sort of non-overlap sort of areas, which you're probably almost like not uniquely, but like specifically positioned to like pick out after, working so long as a consultant and now sort of doing similar work, like looking at similar questions, but now on the academic side. What are the things that stand out to you that are just infuriating, like non-overlaps or like weird brain jarring things you've had to adjust to?
I think it's the one is the consulting versus kind of the scientific research. Goes hand in hand with that is the academic freedom thing. It'd be like if you're working on the consulting side, you don't want to make the client look good, if you will. And so you have to set right up front that, if you're doing science, we're going to publish the results, whether they're good or bad. You can have your name withheld or whatever, but you have a different kind of responsibility kind of in the science space. So I think that's probably the biggest area. I think there's also a lot of areas where, there's like a lack of respect for the science and kind of, for example, if you have a control and treatment group and, someone in marketing basically says, well, we noticed that some of these people weren't getting a message. And so we decided to send the message to the other group as well.
No.
And the protocol wasn't followed, and all of a sudden, so they're used to consistency and, making, the company look good, if you will. And so you have to guard from that all around the place. So I think it's a lot on the execution side, I would say, is the big things, if you will.
Okay, but it sounds as though you've been able to navigate those non-overlaps pretty successfully, would you say? Or have there been some hiccups?
I think that's been successful for the most part. Trying to think. I mean, the big gap is companies move fast, let me put it this way: they want results fast. Executing things might take a while because you want to do this scientifically, carefully. So there's a lot of gaps there, right? Company wants results fast, but executing and getting prepped properly, maybe there's not enough care there. And then the whole results writing process is a big gap there with, companies like, I thought you'd like finish that 2 years ago and you're still writing about it, right? So that's, otherwise I've navigated there. But I mean, I think there's sometimes been some expectations missed maybe on those 3 areas, if you will.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay. And do you feel as though, I guess on the other side, if within the world of academia, people maybe have labeled you as like a non-academic or a consultant and not an academic, do you feel, what is the bias from that side? What do academics get wrong about consultants?
What do academics get wrong about consultants? I mean, let's see. What do academics get? Since I've been working with the folks for a while, I don't know if I have experience with the circle of folks that I work with, but I am sure that there is some bias against those who are, work kind of this angle from the professional side, if you will. And I don't know the right answer to that. I mean, I think even this research that is somewhat, empirical, you poke people and you see what they do, right? Is that certain segments of the academic community probably they don't like that as much, right? They treat it with a different level of respect. So, I mean, I don't know if it's any different than what all other, some segments of researchers within the academic community face as well. Those, I mean, we're just in a separate stream of pursuing knowledge, I guess, where we're very practical, and it has to actually affect outcomes, and the theoretical side is important too, but it's probably didn't Cialdini write a paper a while back that says we have to break up? Like, he was like, just seeing the way that the area was going, he's like, he could not make it in academia now because it was like, you just, do these things that result in outcomes, and it's there's not a lot of, I'm not doing the paper justice, but he's like, it's not the same level of the research, right?
We'll make sure to link it below so the listener can read the paper and get their own idea of what that paper is about.
Exactly.
How about that? So, I mean, I'm just trying to imagine how, because of my expertise or my topic of the PhD was also in financial decision making. And so I'm just trying to figure out how different our entrances into the PhD must have been, given your work experience and the fact that you probably already had a large network and companies that you had ties with that could have, or that were at least willing to provide you with data. Do you feel, was that the reality for you, that you went into the PhD, you had a topic that you had a background in, and that you had companies lined up that you could work with? Is that how you entered the PhD?
That's how I entered the PhD. That was my thinking. That's not exactly how it played out. I mean,
shame.
Part of the application process. Well, I mean, if you think about it, the timeline for applying for the PhD was like a year in advance. I wrote it about studying leakage, I think was, which is the leakage out of the retirement accounts. A year had passed by the time I'm admitted. And then there's, all the core stuff that you're doing. Now, we're talking 2.5 years have elapsed. My contacts or whatever in this space are no longer there. And then the other thing is I work with a lot of academics, and companies only have so much bandwidth to do research. And so I have a certain need to get through the PhD program and be the primary lead on this, and I'm competing against other projects in the pipeline.
Sure.
And so, and as a non-senior person, you're lower on the pecking order, regardless of my professional experience.
Sure.
So, no, that was a big struggle.
Okay.
To actually, it was a bit more of a struggle to get data than I expected. Mainly because the time frame between when I proposed and when I get there lagged by a lot. And then you have to wait till the stars kind of align with the company. Are they ready to implement something? So it's a very tricky thing.
Yeah, no, I guess my perception of how you entered the PhD and how you just flew and sailed through it is completely misguided.
Yes,
Completely misguided. Well, I'm glad to know we both struggled. Sadly, we were in it together. But so then realistically, I think maybe also more on a practical note, and for the audience, maybe even advice. How did you go about it in the end? How did you get your data?
I mean, it was persistence. I mean, but I mean, you really had to maneuver. I mean, it took me good 3 years. I'd have had discussion. I was about ready to give up with companies at the beginning of my PhD. And then, so I decided that's when I started having to do field research. And then I started giving talks doing lab research. And I started doing talks on lab research. I did that in an industry forum. And then at some point I went to dinner with some folks. And then I had this one trick actually that I probably should have come up with earlier, which was mentioning that a competitor was interested in doing it. And they were interested in doing it. This was not, but maybe there was another way of doing it, that you were shopping it to multiple people in the space. I could have probably done that framing a little bit better. And then they realized that, okay, maybe this opportunity, might not be here forever. So that was the final thing, but it took me 3 years of doing that and pitching. I was creating things for advisors. There's like so many pitches we had to give on that thing. I was about ready to give up, and then I got lucky. And that research launched, and then the pandemic happened in the middle, which was an interesting sort of little event to analyze, but yes.
Yeah, how was that? How did I know this is like not a simple, straightforward question to answer, but how did the pandemic interact with your PhD?
I mean, we couldn't travel anymore, which was difficult since I did my PhD. I basically commuted to London like every few months, if you will, and during the pandemic that all shut down. But fortunately, I was through all of my all of the core training, if you will. And so it was mostly everything in the field. So it only showed up in the data, which was, the bottom line was that people ended up saving more. People who were savers, right, ended up saving more during the pandemic. That was probably the big thing, probably because they were just like not spending, right?
Yeah, essentially.
That's a big thing.
Yeah, I've seen similar things in my data where it's just like, oh, suddenly you're all saving money. How good. Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. But you were sort of lucky that most of the reason for travel, you didn't need to do it anymore once the pandemic hit.
I mean, I got lucky in terms of timing. I mean, it's just it's heartbreaking though to see some of the things where people were doing field research and they can't travel, or sociology-based research was just shut down practically, right? Some of that.
Yeah.
So that's just awful, and it's probably still feeling the effects, I'm sure.
And great behavior by universities, like, oh yeah, just have a 6-month extension, but it's unfunded.
Yeah.
And you're like, that will fix things. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, guys.
I'm happy to hear that you were lucky in your regard, even though you were affected. You still were able to graduate. But,
yes.
How does it feel having graduated now? Like you mentioned, one of the reasons for doing the PhD in the first place was maybe this sort of professional capital that it would afford you.
Yes.
How have you seen the sort of the effects of this capital?
Yeah, I mean, I started to see that, and it feels good. I would say that you make it to the end of the journey, it feels good. I've been asked to give more talks, I would say, than in the past. I do notice that people ask me a bit more for my advice within the area that I've studied, if you will. So that's I think that's been generally a good thing, and it felt really good. I came home from the on a plane ride and was interacting with someone. Someone called me a professor for once. So that felt good. It was a small things in life you'll take.
Fair enough. That actually is funny that you mentioned, having been called professor, because that kind of gets me to the next question. We normally ask a lot of the people that we talk to, you've now gotten out of the PhD. A lot of them have progressed either to industry or continue in academia, and they've then progressed to postdocs and whatnot. But then I guess with you, I don't think you've been through the econ job market where you did hundreds of job applications somehow. No. Because I think that approaching the job market, given your CV, is very, very different. So what exactly did you do?
After the PhD or job market? Well, job market-wise. Mostly, so I guess I'm a little unique in that sense that, I've mostly hunted for my own work as an independent, and also running this behavioral science consultancy. So it's not really, I don't know, I guess maybe I have done jobs. When I did do jobs, I started out as a consulting relationship. It's like, before we get married, maybe we'll do things, see if we like each other, right? Well, so that I started that way. And that's very different, right, than the job market talks, right? Very. Talks. So it'd be hard to compare, I think, unless you're going to industry. Maybe you could do that if you're doing industry. Most of the listeners go to academic jobs, you would say, though, or you have a mixture?
Very mixed.
To be honest, we haven't. I don't know how you know this, Merle, because we haven't actually collected any data on
because of the people who tell me that they're listening.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
They reach out like, selection.
They're like, oh, I really enjoyed this. There's a lot of hype around this series. A lot of people seem to really enjoy it, and they're like, oh, I'm so glad you interviewed this person about this, because I've also been thinking about moving into industry, or like the PhD is not working out the way I thought it would. I think it's a pretty eclectic mix, but I wouldn't be surprised if the majority actually still wanted to go into industry. From the small biased sample that I've taken.
Yeah. So, I mean, how would you go about creating these relationships with businesses? The sort of the trials of like, see if you like working with me first. Would you sort of recommend just knocking on a couple of doors and putting yourself out there, or how would you do it?
I think probably you need to have an introduction, generally speaking. Even at my phase, you can waste a lot of time without an introduction. So you should get an introduction is the main thing. And then it's usually, at least my style is more about figuring out what kinds of issues people are facing and how you can help. And you're not like putting out your services really. You're really just trying to assess how they can be helped. And, maybe there's people you can connect them with that can help them. But then you might ideate and say, there's an opportunity I can help you with this or whatever. So yeah, I've run into some of those situations, or sometimes I've helped people find jobs. For example, one person I helped with, they were starting a behavioral science unit, and they needed to have as part of their job application, had to come up with like a 30, 60, 90-day plan for behavioral science. And how would you incubate that kind of unit? And so basically help them put together their pitch deck for interviewing with that position. Then once they got that position, I helped them with kind of doing that work, if you will. So I think if you take the orientation of helping people first, and then you can see whether you can sell, but I wouldn't come out like hard selling, if you will.
Yeah.
That's not my style, at least.
No. Okay, it's good to know.
So, yeah. I mean, maybe in research, you might have to put out some trial balloons, if you will, and indicate, this is the kind of research. One thing that we did like recently was to put out these, are we calling them RFIs? But it's basically, we're doing research in this particular area, and we invite companies who are interested to kind of contact us. That would be, I guess that's a little bit more of a sales thing, but you have it kind of written down in like a one page, what you're looking to do.
Yeah.
And then you leverage your networks and send it around.
Okay. Interesting.
Good to
Interesting. Good to know. So yeah, I don't know. I can see we're coming up to the 40-minute mark. So thinking about how to wrap this up. Mel, do you have any sort of last pressing questions that you want to get in?
Well, I think in general the way to go about this, I mean, as we ask everyone towards the end, where do you see yourself going in the upcoming 5 years? What is the future?
Yeah, so I think the next 5 years is going to be very much in line with sort of the approach I've had in the past, which is to kind of experiment. I will probably, I'm just going to spend 30% of my time looking at teaching and kind of research and getting more involved with academia and maintaining the other balance kind of in consulting. But I could wind up down any of these paths where I might, totally dislike that balance, and I might shift completely back towards consulting, or I might find that I really like research and just want to do that full time. So I'm going to, basically use this time to kind of feel things out and see how well it kind of matches my, what I want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And who knows, maybe in 5 years' time you won't even be a consultant anymore.
That's right. That's right. Who knows what the future holds?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's okay. I'm just imagining there's some sort of multiverse with there's a million different versions of Steve and
yes.
your career.
Yes.
And in some of them you're not a consultant anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I do want to do on any of these paths is I do, given the state of my career, I want to do something that's good for society. So the thing that I like about academia is, or doing kind of this teaching, it's clearly not for the money. It's to kind of give back to students. And the research, I would like to do kind of meaningful research that will affect outcomes with folks. And at least for the past 5 to 10 years, I've only tried to do consulting work that I think is for like a greater good, not just selling more boxes or whatever it is, right?
Sure.
So that's something that's going to need to be a necessary requirement too for whatever I do.
All right. Yeah. Well, then I'm looking forward to your work. I'm super keen for it. So, Steve, if it's probably not just me who's super keen to read and hear more about your work, it's probably the listener too. So where would you direct the listener? Where can they keep up with you? Where can they find you online?
So I do have a personal blog at steveshuconsulting.com. That's probably the easiest way. Or you can connect with me on LinkedIn as well, Steve Shu, STEV SHU. That's probably the easiest way.
Okay, then. We will make sure to link those below so that people can find you with the least amount of friction humanly possible. Steve,
Great.
Thank you so much for making the time to talk to us. I really, really enjoyed this, especially getting a perspective from someone who's had so much industry experience already and how you went through the PhD. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So that was our episode with Steve Shu. First of all, thank you, Steve, so much for coming on the podcast, despite your incredibly busy schedule. We really appreciate it. And congratulations on finishing the PhD. Huge congrats. Merle, what did you make of our conversation?
I am just really glad we interviewed someone with the experience that Steve has. I think it has to some extent confirmed some of the suspicions that I had about, people with work experience who then do a PhD. It has also destroyed some of the suspicions I had. I mean, I thought he'd literally be walking in with like loads of data and all his collaborations and contacts and just being like, just dropping some publications, getting a PhD and moving the fuck on. So, I mean, Steve had his own struggles, as everyone has in the PhD. And obviously one of those struggles is that academia and industry, or academia and corporate business, if you will, just do not move on the same timeline. They just do not. So it's just really, really interesting to hear that. But yeah, I'm just really happy to have gotten this perspective. And I am still sticking with my original opinion. No one can tell me otherwise, really no one. And it's probably a good idea if you have a couple of years of work experience, whether that's industry or government or policy or whatever, before you dive into a PhD. I genuinely still think that maybe you are a bit too young as a person to dive straight into the PhD from a master's degree, for example. But maybe I'm also just completely making it about myself because I was 21 when I started the PhD, and in hindsight, I'm like, oh my God, I was such a baby. Please, someone get this child out of here. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, I have to admit, like, it was really cool to hear about Steve's career and like the range of experience that he's had. Definitely. And how that has brought him to do the PhD and complete the PhD and what's next. And also, interesting to hear about these sort of inconsistencies between the two industries, right? That you sort of have to work together if you want to have access to the data and you want to have access to the insights and sort of, the techniques on how to develop the insights from the academics. You need to work together, but there are some fundamental, non-overlaps, which were really cool to hear about. In terms of this question of, it's sort of better in general to take time out of academia before coming back in. I think it's difficult. Like, I could tell that you have an opinion about it when you were asking the question. like there's, there was no real devil's advocate or no real neutrality in the delivery of those questions. But I think it's a really difficult one to, talk broadly about, because I mean, at least in the UK, we are trying to move in economics towards this American style model. And, you might hear that phrase, American style model, and be like, what on earth is that? Well, that's basically just spending more time in the actual PhD, doing more taught courses, so maybe doing like 2 years of taught courses before doing like 4 years of research.
Yeah, essentially sort of known as an MRes to a lot of the rest of Europe.
Yeah, exactly, which is sort of additional years of your life spent getting the same qualification.
Yeah.
And I think that has real implications for who's opting in.
Oh, 100%
degree.
Absolutely.
And honestly, it's I think one of the reasons why people who come and do a PhD after they've spent time working, one of the reasons why these students or undertaking the PhD are maybe more successful or have a better time during the PhD is to do with selection, right? It's that these students are really highly motivated. They've been able to, make sure and, make sure that doing the PhD is the right move for them. It is going to be worthwhile. It is going to help them progress in general. And if it doesn't work out, then also they have something to fall back on. So there is a sort of a selection effect there. But yeah, it's so hard. I think, as Steve was saying, the time spent doing a PhD, like taking time out of work to do a PhD, it is really costly. In terms of your life and your development and, you know, getting to where you want to go. And I'm not, I don't know. I don't think academia at the moment, moving towards the American style model, there's going to be it's going to affect hugely who is going to opt in to do a PhD. And I think it will have huge implications for the gender split in economics. And that's just not something not something that when people talk about moving towards American style model, that's not a conversation I hear a lot accompanying that, is how that's going to affect who's opting in and how the sort of the gender dynamic is going to be affected, because I don't think it's going to get worse.
I mean, there's definitely an argument to be made for that. I think with the American system, or just making PhDs longer, there are definitely some arguments to be made for it, and then there are arguments to be made against it. And I don't think either side is fully being explored. But in most debates, that is an issue that you run into, especially if those who are most impacted are maybe not necessarily part of that debate or aren't being heard as much as they should. I mean, when we look at, like, you know, bias in who sampling bias, or selection bias rather in this case, I think Steve will have a very specific personality and has very specific experience as well, because there's loads of people in industry who maybe work in the same topics that he does, but that they don't opt in for doing a PhD, that they don't have the desire to get this type of qualification for whatever reason. I think maybe Steve's wife might have also played a role. We didn't discuss this, but she is an academic, so I wonder how much of a role she played. But unfortunately, the interview is over, so maybe we should pop him an email and see, like, hey, Steve, by the way, you know, how has your wife influenced your life choices? And I think then we'll get paragraphs and paragraphs on end, you know, as your life partner should probably influence quite a few things that you end up doing in your life. Anyway, I think we're going on quite a tangent. Always happy to discuss more, but guys, I hope you had a great time listening to this episode. I hope you learned something interesting, or that, you know, worst case scenario, it was thought-provoking or just entertaining. And you know what, we'll take that, definitely. So that is it for us today. We hope you have a great week, and as always, we hope to see you again next week.
You're the one I love.